Hey, good morning. Glad to have you here for our next installment of our study of Good News, the Gospel according to Mark. We're going into the next chapter as we go into chapter 10 and the first part of it. And it's not about one of those subjects that people get real excited about. In fact, in general, maybe I should say, do get excited about it. They can be very split about it because this is where Jesus teaches about adultery and divorce, and man, all kinds of people use his words to support all kinds of things in their theories about it. But we're going to look at what Jesus actually said and see if we can make some sense of it for us today. So I'm going to be reading from the New American Standard Version. You pick up whatever version is good for you, and we're going to make our way through this very first part of chapter 10 of the Gospel of Mark. It says, getting up. Remember, he was in Capernaum previously, and they had that great day of ministry, had been in the house. He gets up. He went from there to the region of Judea and beyond the Jordan. So he's going across to the north part of the Sea of Galilee. He'd be headed over maybe toward Bethsaida, where a lot of people say he may have gone. Same route that you would go, and maybe even if you went to the north on the other side, you'd go up to Caesarea Philippi and the villages around there where he'd been before. Of course, if you went on up further, you'd go on the road toward Damascus. But probably around Bethsaida area is our guess. People around that area, people knew who Jesus was. A crowd begins to grow. Uh, and so he went beyond the Jordan. Crowds gathered around him again. And according to his custom, he once more began to teach them. Some Pharisees came up to Jesus, testing him, and began to question him whether it was lawful for a man to divorce a wife. And he, being Jesus, answered and said to them, well, what did Moses command you? And they said, Moses permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce and send her away. But Jesus said to them, because of your hardness of heart, he wrote you this commandment. But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother, and the two shall become one flesh, so that they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, God has joined together, let no man separate. In the house, is where they're staying there, the disciples began to question him, Jesus, about this again. And he said to them, whoever divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery against her. And if she herself divorces her husband and marries another man, she is committing adultery. Again, Mark is short and to the point and tells us this story about Jesus and his moving along. When I talked about where he'd gone to as we were getting into the text, goes over to the other side of the Jordan. He's obviously talking to Jewish people, people who knew God, who were raised up in the law, and they're trying to figure out, how do we honor God? How do we live by his words? Pharisees are telling us one thing, Jesus, we hear you telling us another. We're trying to figure out how we're supposed to be living. We're still sort of doing that today. They got together, and according to his custom, wouldn't you like to be known for teaching God's truth? I mean, Jesus was starting to be recognized that if he showed up, well, he might provide healing. He might do a miracle. Maybe one of those signs that shows that he's the Son of God. But one of the things he always does is teach. This term didaskale, which is based on the word to give. He gives them a gift of truth, of helping them understand what it is that God was trying to do through the words of Moses and the commands that they had received, and how they were trying to follow them. Some Pharisees, and again, the Pharisees were those leaders in the church who were trying to get everyone to follow God their particular way. Pharim is a word for being pure, and they thought that they all need to be following in a pure life before God, and in doing so, that would help usher in the Messiah, even though they were missing the Messiah right before their very own eyes. And so at this time, here they are. They are trying to question, it says here, test him. It is a word for interrogating on that critical side of things. It's not the word for tempting, although sometimes it get translated that way. They're really trying to put Jesus on the mark, trying to see what he is going to say to some of these really tough issues. You pin down someone who's a religious leader. You say, okay, tell me what the Bible teaches about divorce. They may tell you a lot of things, but at least Jesus goes back to the very thing that you should always begin with. Okay, you asked me about divorce because these Pharisees came up to Jesus, testing him, questioning him whether it was lawful, that is, permitted for a man to divorce his wife. And Jesus answered, red letters, well, what did Moses tell you? Great place to start. What does the Bible say? Man, if someone talks to you about anything, hey, I want to talk to you about baptism. I want to talk to you about voting. I want to talk to you about how to take care of the poor. Whatever subject they bring up to you, and the best place to start is, what does the Bible say about that? Let's wrestle with what is there first to make sure we understand it right. And obviously, as we went through this text, the Pharisees weren't understanding it right, which is why their application wasn't right. Because remember, they basically were trying to show themselves righteous while finding the loopholes because of their legalism to do what their flesh wanted rather than really submitting themselves and doing what God would want them to do. Because let's be honest, what God wants us to do, it's not easy. Often goes against our very nature, but it's always better for us. Even if when we hear it, it just doesn't sound that way. So they answered Jesus and they quoted to him from Deuteronomy, the 24th chapter. Moses permitted, the word a man is not in the text, aner, but it is in the Hebrew, in the Deuteronomy passage, to write a certificate of divorce and to send her away. Now, I don't know if you've seen that passage in a long time, but I thought maybe we would look at it together just a little bit. So if you can flip back into the Old Testament to the 24th chapter, verse 1, because it's not just verse 1 of the 24th chapter that talks about the divorce, but the first 5 verses. Offering divorce is not something that was questioned. They were allowed to do it. And this is from that 24th chapter. When a man, a husband, takes a woman and marries her, and it's sort of interesting. I didn't notice this before until I was studying for this, but the word for marries her in the Hebrew is the word Baal. Now, you may have heard that as one of the names for one of the false gods, but Baal becomes from a word that actually usually is just the word to be the leader of or to be the master over. And that just sort of implies their understanding of the relationship to start with. When a man takes a wife and is master of her, that has to be a literal translation. I know a lot of people want to argue with me about that, but I want you to sort of keep that concept in mind, even though we would probably rightly say marries her. And it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her. Now, this word for indecency in the Hebrew is the word nakedness. It gets translated that way most of the time. If you were to take this word, do a word study, go through and read all the places, the majority of the time, probably close to 80% of the time, it gets translated as nakedness. And it often is used in an idiom to uncover one's nakedness. It's always used in the context of a sexual kind of relationship. And so there are a lot of discussion about what this means and what the kind of indecency is talking about. Probably talking about an infidelity of some sort. And because there are also some other places that uses the same term where a man uh, takes his wife, and on their wedding day they consummate it, and the bed sheets, which would then be stained with the blood of the woman because of that, which showed her virginity, would be taken by her parents in case that guy would later say, hey, they gave me their daughter as a bride and she wasn't a virgin when she showed up. Parents could go back and show those bed sheets and say, oh, yeah, she was. And then the man would be punished. Again, that law's in the Bible because of man's evil ways, trying to follow the flesh rather than follow God, but still try to be seen as being righteous. So there's a lot of deception that goes on that these rules are trying to offset. And so this is talking about some kind of a sexual, whether it's pre or it's adultery later. But this man has this wife and he doesn't find favor in her because of some sexual indiscretion, having sex with another person. And so he writes her a certificate of divorce, puts it in her hand, and sends her out of the house. There's no question that that's okay to do according to this passage. But it goes on. That's not the real problem. Because we're talking about a man here who had other choices. If you catch someone, even your wife, in adultery, you don't have to get rid of them. You could forgive them. I know, radical concept. But you have to remember that the majority of times that the word adultery is used in the Old Testament, it's not talking about a husband and wife, but it's talking about God and Israel. And it's always talking about a spiritual adultery in which Israel turns to another God. Israel turns to another way, turns away from God, divorces God, seeks after another, even worships him. And in the end, they come back and God forgives them for their adultery and brings them back into his life as this unstained wife in that image that we get in the New Testament. So there is a choice here, which would be God's kind of choice. But that kind of choice is hard for us. And sometimes, even in the context, we get a phrase in the New Testament that says, what's impossible for man is possible with God. In context, one particular place, it's talking about this ability to forgive, where man, we can't let it go. So this man divorces his wife instead of forgiving her because she has committed a indiscretion sexually. She leaves his house, becomes another man's wife. And the same thing happens there. He uncovers a nakedness and he also writes her certificate, or perhaps he dies and she's set free because of death, gives both options there. But the first husband isn't allowed to take her back as his wife for the second time. In fact, if you go on down here, it says that the former husband who sent her away is not allowed to take her again to be his wife since she has been defiled. That is, he had the opportunity, gave it up, sent her off. This is what I want to do. And it says that when a man takes her back, that is an abomination before the Lord. Not the original divorce, not even if it was the adultery, but the man who won't forgive and sends her away and puts her in these other situations where she has to live as someone else's husband and has to do whatever's going on there, and then brings her back later after that. I'll take you now. And God says, no, that's an abomination. It's abomination because of this idea of forgiveness. The husband is supposed to be following God's example. Jesus said that. Paul used it in writing to young couples, saying, hey, husbands, you got to love your wife like Christ loves the church. Think about how Christ loves the church. Forgiving and graceful. Us, the church, us who sin, us who find things to do that are not godly. We come back to God sorrowful, repentant, and God forgives us. Man, the husband is supposed to be taking the lead and forgiving the wife. Now, that's not to imply that the wife is always the one doing stuff wrong. Husbands do plenty of stuff wrong, but it goes the other way too. The wife is also supposed to be forgiving the husband when they come back in the same way. So it's got to be a lot of forgiveness in here, a lot of God's kind of love, which is forgiving of sin kind of love. And that is hard to do. We get to a point where we don't want to forgive like God forgives, but we want to be forgiven by God. It's hard for us to pass that along, even to someone that we love, or maybe even especially, because when someone we love turns away from this that way, man, it's a deep hurt. It's a sorrowful hurt. And so that's why Jesus said they were giving an exception. He says in verse 5 of our text in Mark 10, because of your hardness of heart, he wrote to you this commandment. The hardness of heart is the unwilling to forgive sin. And sometimes we have that hard heart. We don't forgive easily. And Jesus said, hey, Moses gave you, hey, if there's a infidelity here, you can do it. In fact, in Matthew, it makes it real clear where it says, except for adultery, in Matthew's version of this account. But Jesus harkens back, says, hey, let me tell you about God's original plan, okay? Not the muck plan that we've got going on here, but God's original plan, what he did from the very beginning is that he made them male and female. Now that in itself today can get you in trouble when you start to get into gender and you start, limiting gender identity to biological evidence, because we live in a society that has said we want something different. For those of us who are following God, we take the word that reveals to us that there are men and that there are women. Now, psychologically, we can think a lot of things about ourselves. We can have all kinds of concepts about ourselves. We can feel certain ways about ourselves. We can even resonate in thinking that this is a natural, intuitive response of our flesh. But the scriptures talk to us. It says, hey, God created a male, he created a female that complement one another, that were made for one another, that one was incomplete. Remember, Adam went through that whole expression where he was looking at everybody else, all the other animals, they were male and female, they had partners, and he didn't. And he went through everything and says, man, there's nothing out there to make me whole. There's nothing out there to complement me so that I can finally be what I'm really supposed to be. And in God's plan, we're really not who we are until we have that complement of male and female together becoming one. That was God's original plan. And he says, hey, if this is God's original plan, man, no one should separate it. Lots of people do separate it. And in particular here, what God has joined together, let no man separate, especially the husband. You've got to take the lead in forgiveness in all things. God's original plan. Now we move on. Because of the hardness of our hearts and our inability to forgive, he allowed divorce. And just by the way, divorce is not the unpardonable sin. Adultery is not the unpardonable sin. We can be forgiven. And we need to recognize it. We need to repent of it. And we need to seek forgiveness. And we need to get ourselves back on track with God. And so that was kind of a hard teaching that Jesus made publicly. And when they get home, they get to a house that night, his disciples, they ask him, say, hey, Jesus, we want to get clear about this because you're talking about the nuts and bolts of life here. Um, we know people who aren't going to like what you're saying, and people who are going to try to figure out how to, you know, be legalistic about it, because the problem that they were having is that there were some men who would take these scriptures and they would just simply be comparing their wife to someone else. Hey man, that gal looks a whole lot better than my wife. I'm really attracted to that gal. And I'm not so much anymore. And so I'm just going to get rid of her and I'm going to go get someone new. That was happening. And Jesus was trying to offset those people who thought that that kind of behavior was godly, that God was really okay with it because they gave her a certificate of divorce. And Jesus saying, no, guys, God is not going to say that you're righteous and you're doing what's right because you're following your lust instead of honoring your vows. Didn't say this about chapter 24 of Deuteronomy, but it's in a whole section about keeping your promises and holding up your end of commitments in all various kinds of areas of your life. And in this most important commitment, we need to be able to do what is called on us to hold to our original commitment as much and as hard as we can. And so they ask the question, and Jesus says, whoever divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery against her. Think about what Jesus just said. If you decide to divorce your wife, that is, if you decide not to forgive your wife and you go after another woman and you marry her, or using the situation that was going on, if you say, I don't like the way you wash the dishes, I don't like you're not pleasing me, you're not making me happy, you're not serving my every need, I think this other person will, I'm going to get rid of you so I can get this other person. That's what Jesus is talking about. Whoever lets his wife go so that he can take off after someone else that he thinks is better now, breaking his commitment to his wife, he's committing adultery. He may think that he's justified before God because he's gone through the motions, but he's not. Going back to that, God's original plan is for you to be together with your wife or your husband and go through and grow through life together. That's God's plan. And the verse 12 is just the opposite is true. If a woman's doing the same thing, same situation, if a woman just is getting rid of her husband so she can take off after another man, she's also committing adultery because she's not keeping that first commandment. And so that's what Jesus was talking about. There are people who have taken God's word and they have made a legal system out of it. They've found a loophole in it so that they can follow the desires and lusts of their flesh and say, hey, God, I know I'm acting on my lust and desires, but I follow your rules, so we're all good, right? No. God is looking for someone who's willing to follow his example of love and grace and forgiveness, who's willing to keep their commitments as strongly and as much as they can. And he knows that while that's possible for him, that there's that point where we do have that weakness, that hardness of heart, and so there is that exception for adultery. But even then, I think God would rather see us be able to even forgive that. Grace is something we all long for. And when you've really experienced God's grace, you've been broken and you recognize your sin and you cry out for forgiveness, there is nothing better than being forgiven. And that's true for every relationship in our lives. That's why Jesus died on the cross. He's given us the power of resurrection and the fullness of his Spirit that we might live with the same love and grace and mercy that he has set before us. Hope that God has spoken to you through this session as we looked at the good news according to Mark. And I'm looking forward to our next portion as we step through and Jesus teaches us a little bit about our relationship with children and as we move on. God bless, and I'll see you next week.